All right. Well, it's going to be a fun class for me this morning. I don't know if y'all is going to enjoy it or not, but it's going to be fun for me. So, uh, anyway, we've been kind of talking about this a little bit, talking about church history and talking about some early church history. Some of the early church fathers, talked about them a little bit last time. Talked about Irenaeus and Valentinus and the conflict they had between Gnosticism, and we talked about persecution of Christians before we came to Constantine. And we talked about Constantine coming into power in the 300 AD area and how he took Christianity as the religion of Rome, and how he gave land and money to the church. And basically that was the start of Catholicism and how that still exists today. We talked some about, turn off some lights, talked some about and how that became so big and that church became so big. We talked about the fact that we had these councils where churches got together and the church got together and discussed these things, and how things came out of these councils, especially the first Council of Nice in 325 and the Council of Constantinople in 381, and the Synod of Hippo. That's basically where they canonized the 27 books of the New Testament that you hold today. It was the Council of Hippo. But the Council of Nice, we got the Nicene Creed came out of that, and this Nicene Creed is what became this creed that basically you had to say defined the faith, and it also is going to become a point of contention. It's going to divide the East and the West churches. We'll talk about that a little bit. In the early church, there were 5 major sees. They called them centers. These sees were known as the apostolic sees. They were said to have been founded by the apostles. The sees at Rome and Antioch in Syria were established by Peter. The see at Constantinople, Byzantine, by Andrew. The see at Alexandria, Egypt, by Mark, and the see at Jerusalem by James. The word see comes from the Latin word for seat. So there were these 5 different sees of Christianity in the early church, and then eventually those are kind of going to be united underneath the Catholic Church. We're not going to talk about this guy much, but in the timeline, this is his time. So I kind of wanted to introduce him. We'll talk about him quite a bit more probably next week. But this is St. Jerome. And St. Jerome was a guy who went to Jerusalem and lived in a cave. And it's about the same time as Constantine, about 347 to 420 AD. He is who translated he made the Latin Vulgate out of the original Hebrew and Greek text. It's important because he had access to a lot of texts that are now gone, that are now destroyed. But he did translate that into Latin. And the Vulgate became became the Bible of the Catholic Church. The Latin Vulgate still kind of is to this day. Masses were always used to be said in Latin. So the Vulgate, he's really instrumental in that. A lot of his early translations were used in translating the Bible that you hold today, because a lot of the things that he did, like I said, the manuscripts that he had access to in Jerusalem, we no longer have. So they've been lost to antiquity. So Jerome was very, very important in getting the Bible that we have. He was very instrumental in that. So I just kind of wanted to throw him in there because this is kind of our timeline, but we'll come back to him when we start talking a little bit about the Bible. We talked a little bit about the Council of Nice, and out of that came the Nicene Creed. We read that last week. The Nicene Creed basically comes with this idea of what we call filioque. And that is the concept of whether Jesus was God or Jesus was created. That's going to become a big point of contention in the early church. It came from a guy named Arian. We call it Arianism. And Arianism basically is the concept or the theology that Jesus Christ was created by God before the foundation of the earth. That Jesus is a created being. Therefore, he's less than God. Okay? Of course, the Nicene Creed says that Jesus is equal to God, that Jesus is eternal, that Jesus is God, which is how we look at it. But a lot of people didn't agree with that. It was a big point of contention. And because of that, that was part of the split between the East and the West Church. Also, the issue of leavened or unleavened bread and communion was a big point of contention. Also, the thought of papal authority was a big point of contention. So there were several things that are going to cause this division between the East-West. The capital of Rome was moved to Constantinople. We'll talk about that a little bit. And that will eventually become the Byzantine Empire after Rome falls. We'll talk about that a little bit. This really isn't a history class. It's more church history than history, but history kind of falls into it a little bit, so we got to talk about it. We talked about the 325. We talked about the Council of Nice, which was really, really pivotal. The capital, Constantine is going to move the capital of Rome to Constantinople. Well, there's a couple of reasons for that, and eventually the Roman Empire is going to split into the East and the West. That's not happening right now. It's still one empire, but he wanted to move it to Constantinople because of the location of Constantinople, which is up here on the Black Sea, and because of that, it's a major trade route. It was easier to protect the Eastern Roman Empire. I'm going the wrong way. It was easier to protect the Eastern Roman Empire. So Constantinople right here is going to become, Rome's down in here. Constantinople is going to become the capital of Rome, the main capital of Rome. And Rome is going to become the old capital. So he's going to move everything up here basically just because it's more strategic. It's a better place to be. So he's going to move stuff to Constantinople, but that's going to play into church history also. So I had to bring that up a little bit. So let me back up a little bit. And then in about 1054, we have what's called the Great Schism. It's also called the East-West Schism. And that's where the church divided into the Eastern Church, which would today, we would call that the Orthodox Church, and the Western Church, which we will call the Catholic Church. We'll get to a map. Okay, so so you have this schism. So we're centuries away from Constantine now, right? We've bypassed a lot of centuries, and that's okay because we're not worried about that. But when we get to this point, we finally have this break between the Orthodox and the Catholic. You and I, we came out of what's called the Protestant movement. We're not there yet, so I'll explain that when we get there. Y'all aren't Protestants. You might think you are, but you're not. So we come out of the Protestant movement, okay? And that Protestant movement was out of Catholicism. So you and I, we're whether, I don't want to say this wrong, but we're not Catholic, but Catholic influenced American religion because we came from the West, okay? If we would have came from the East, we would have looked a whole lot different than we look. Does that make any sense? You know, we were born into a different house, if you want to look at it that way, right? So we talk a little bit about that. Let me back up now. So, wrong way. We're all getting into okay, so let's go back. So that's the East-West Schism, which is this division. And that happened because of filioque, which is whether Christ was created or whether Christ is God. The Western Catholic Church took the notion that Christ is the same as God, that Christ is eternal. The Orthodox Church took the idea or the concept of Arianism, which says that Jesus Christ was created by God. So there's a difference. And also, leavened and unleavened bread and communion. The Eastern Church uses leavened bread and communion. The Western Church uses unleavened bread and communion. And also the idea of papal authority, which we're not going to get big into that, but so those became a division, and eventually they divided in the Great Schism, and it split into two different major churches. So, I guess I put that down. Yeah, go ahead. You know, it's one of those things that, you know, we're looking at that on Wednesday night on that. We looked at that a lot on communion, why we used unleavened bread, because Jesus Christ used unleavened bread during the Passover, so we use unleavened. And the reason they used leaven, I'm not 100% sure. I can't answer that question. I just know it was a point of division, and they used leavened bread. And I mean, that seems like a little thing to us, like, but little things could be big, you know? I mean, I don't know how else to say it. So I really don't have a good answer to that question, but it was a point of division and part of the division. And, you know, and also the Pope's claim to universal jurisdiction and the place of Constantinople in relation to the Penarchy. So there was things that made them divide, and that was one of them. That would be a good thing to look at. I just haven't really ever looked at it. I just know it's part of it. So anyway, so we're going to move into the dark ages of Christianity this morning, okay? So Christianity got dark. And the reason it did is because we started to get this idea of what's called just war, okay? In other words, there's just and unjust war. Augustine, he kind of made this deal, this just and unjust war, that basically some wars are justified, and you can do that, and that's just. And some wars aren't, right? And the church had so much political influence, and politics and the church were so intertwined that they were able to raise armies, and the Pope, he gave them indulgences, okay, for going to war. In other words, the Pope would say, the Pope could say, all right, if you go to war, in this holy war basically, and you do what you're supposed to do, that, I can give you religious indulgences. I have the authority as Pope that you can, go do these sins and you'll be forgiven, or I'm going to give you these extra indulgences. So the church actually supported these, what we call crusades. And y'all have probably heard of the crusades, and I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on what the crusades were about, but a lot of it basically came down to the idea of retaking Jerusalem. And they did eventually retake Jerusalem. It's a long course in history, and we're not going to get into it, but they did go and they fought the Muslims, right? They fought the Muslims. They took Jerusalem back at times and lost Jerusalem at times, but that's kind of irrelevant to my story. What is relevant to my story is two big things in history: the massacre of the Latins in 1182 and the Fourth Crusade in 1204. Those things are important to us. So Constantinople is now the capital, and the Roman Empire is not what the Roman Empire was, and now we call that the Byzantine Empire. And so basically what happens is the Latins, who would be the Western Church, the Catholics, the Latins who are in Constantinople, which is the center of the Eastern Orthodox Church at this point in history, they pretty much have control of the city. I want to get this down. Okay. I just put this down because I thought maybe, I didn't write this, but I thought, well, this would explain it maybe better than I could explain it. But the reason I want to bring this up is because this is essentially Christians killing Christians here. This is a dark time in history, okay? The massacre of the Latins was a large-scale massacre of the mainly Italian Roman Catholic, called Latin, inhabitants of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, by the Eastern Orthodox population of the city in April of 1182. The Roman Catholics of Constantinople at that time dominated the city's maritime trade and financial sector. Although precise numbers are unavailable, the bulk of the Latin community, estimated at 60,000 at the time, was wiped out or forced to flee. The Genesee and Pisan communities were especially devastated, and some 4,000 survivors were sold as slaves to the Turkish Sultanate of Rum. The massacre further worsened relations and increased enmity between the Western and Eastern Catholic churches, and a sequence of hostilities between the two followed. So I guess reason I want to bring this up is because we talk about the Muslims. We talk about holy war. We talk about how the Muslims kill each other all the time anymore, right? Sects of Muslims are always fighting, killing each other. And they rage these holy wars, these jihads. We're not, Christians, we're the same, did the same stuff. I mean, I don't know how else to say it, And I'm not saying it's right, and I don't agree with it. I'm just saying that is part of our history, and you can't get away from that. We killed each other, and if this was bad, the Fourth Crusade is worse. So there was a point in history where you didn't want, an Orthodox Christian or a Jewish or a Muslim did not want a Latin to knock on their door because they were there to kill them. And that's just the reality of what happened. So we go along with these crusades, the first, the second, and the third crusade. I don't want to talk a lot about those. You can Google it. But the fourth, yeah, go ahead. That would have been the Catholics. The Latins were the Catholics. So, no, the Orthodox people killed the Catholics. So they're in Constantinople, that's Greek Orthodox. But all these Catholics, who we're going to call Latins, which are the Western because they came out of Italy, right? Because the Roman Catholics, Rome is in Italy. So all these Catholics who are in Constantinople, I'll try to make this simple, all these Catholics who are in Constantinople, they kind of ran everything. They had all the finances, they controlled the harbors, they controlled the trade. There's a lot of trade. That's the reason Constantinople is so important, because to come out of the Black Sea, see, that's why he moved the capital, because this is the Black Sea. And to come out of the Black Sea, you've got to pass through this strait right here to get to the Mediterranean, okay? So this is important. This is really, really important in trade. So Rome is out here. Constantine moved the capital to here because, for one thing, he wanted to control Western Rome, and the other thing was he wanted to be on this trade route. But when he did that, all these Catholics, all these people came from Rome to Constantinople, and they kind of took control of all the finances. They had the financial control, they had the trade control, they had control of the harbors, they had all that control. And the Greek Orthodox people, the Greeks, okay, because the Greeks, they didn't like that because the Latins had all that control. So basically, the Orthodox Christians, they killed 60,000 of the Catholic Christians so they could take back control of all that finance and the trade. So the only reason I bring that up is because it's going to play into the Fourth Crusade, because when you start killing each other, you start hating each other, right? And I guess the point I'm trying to make is, when this happens, now there's no love lost between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. They hate each other now, right? Because they've basically killed each other. And so it gets bad. So we go along to the Fourth Crusade. The Third Crusade went poorly. Okay? Third Crusade went poorly. So the Fourth Crusade, they decided they're going to do this different. And so they're going to launch this crusade from Venice. Okay? And in order to do that, you have to have ships, right? So they get the Venetians to build all these ships to transport all these crusaders. Well, a lot of the crusaders didn't leave from Venice. So they had all these ships, and they didn't have money to pay for them because they didn't have enough crusaders leaving from Venice to pay for the ships. So the Venetians said, listen, this is the deal. You're going to have to pay for this. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to go and you're going to kill all these Catholics, fellow Catholics, and you're going to raid the city. And then the next thing you're going to do is you're going to take part of this crusade and you're going to go to Constantinople, and you're going to basically you're going to take Constantinople, you're going to take control of it, you're going to insert a leader there to pay for this crusade. All sounds good, right? So they go and they do this, and they wind up at Constantinople. Now, not all of them did. Some of the crusaders went on to Jerusalem. But they wind up at Constantinople, and they insert this leader. Well, that didn't work. He got killed. So they decided, well, they're just going to sack Constantinople. So that's what they did. They destroyed it. So the crusaders come in now in the Fourth Crusade, and they basically destroy Constantinople. And when they do that, it also shows you the hate, shows you what's going on, shows you the kind of discord of what's going on in the church. So this is the dark ages of the church. This is when we divide for good, divide this apart. And it's still divided apart to this day. And eventually we make the map, right? Eventually we make this map. So eventually we're going to come down to this map. We have Catholicism in the blue, the Catholic Church, Catholicism. We have the Orthodox Church in the green, and we have the Muslims in the yellow, right? Eventually we're going to make this map. History, wars, crusades, hate, division is going to eventually construct this map of the world. And when we get to this map of the world in Christianity, it's going to define us. So now we got to figure out where we actually come from in all this mess. So a lot of history, you can read it. It's pretty interesting, but it was a bad time. All right? It was a bad time. I don't know how else to say it. And to think that Christians do not have blood on their hands, or Christianity, I'm not saying us particularly, but to say Christianity as a faith does not have blood on his hands is very naive. Separation of church and state is a wonderful thing. Let me tell you, when the church runs the state and the state runs the church, it's bad. Government should not run churches. Governments, well, you're going to see that. I'm fixing to explain that to you in detail because we're going to talk about the two doors this morning. Those of you who are big into Game of Thrones, I don't watch that, but the two-door rose, right? You should know that if you're into that stuff. So this is what happens. We're going to go back to this, but this is what happens, right? We have this great schism in the 11th century. Now there's a split ahead of that, okay? And that's the Assyrian church, that's Arianism. Oriental Orthodox and Eastern Orthodox are going to split off before we have this great schism that really doesn't apply to us at all. The Great Schism does in the 11th century. That's where we break apart. We're going to get into the 16th century pretty soon. The Reformation, that's where we're heading. But in order for us to get into this, we need to kind of see why this happens. This big break right here in the 16th century, what we call the Reformation movement. This is where we come from, okay? This is the start of where we come from right here when we break off. So that's what we got to figure out, why that happened. We got to figure out who these people are, Anabaptists, Protestants, Anglicans. We need to kind of figure out who they are and what happened. In order to do that, we got to go back, way back, to Elizabeth of York and Henry Tudor, okay? This was the battle of the War of the Roses, right? The two-door rose. The ever-ambitious Henry Tudor, he settles once and for all the terrible civil war that's been raging across England. This was a battle for supremacy between the Lancasters, the Red Rose, and the Yorks, the White Rose, okay? He wins the decisive victory at the Battle of Bosworth. He marries Elizabeth of York, securing the throne, reuniting both houses under the two-door rose. Cut to 1 year later, the happy couple has their first child, Arthur, in September, bolstered by his good fortune to have a son. Henry VII turns to improving the kingdom's war-torn state, rebuilding the treasury. 3 years later, a daughter is born to them, a lovely princess named Margaret. 2 years later, Henry is born to them, followed 5 years later by a beautiful girl named Mary. Now Henry VII has 2 sons to ensure there be no fear of a future civil war. His dynasty is beginning. He is also blessed with 2 daughters to marry off to secure whatever treaties suits his fancy. So we have these 4 children, Arthur, Margaret, Henry, and Mary, that came out of this illusion. Arthur spent most of his time as his father learning the art of being king. He was given a thorough education, all that was necessary. In order to ensure his sons were in complete control, Henry VII turns his eyes towards his son Henry, who's Henry VIII. He plans he should enter a religious life so that he may one day aspire to the lofty position of cardinal and archbishop of Canterbury. That way, while one son rules the country politically, one would rule religiously. Once again, this joining of church and state. He sees his future as being secure in order to solidify unity of Scotland. Margaret is married to James IV at the tender age of 14. Mary is still a baby and given over the joys of childhood. No, I'm moving through this, but I trust you, this all has to do with us. So we get our Mary, Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII. But that's a little bit muddy, right? If you know the story of the royals, it's kind of muddy. In order to secure alliance with Spain, Arthur has reached the proper age for marriage. He is to be married to the daughter of Spain, Catherine of Aragon. She is a lovely woman, if not a little too devout. Arthur, being too sick to make the journey, stays at home, while Henry rides in his place and stands in for the betrothal ceremony. Back in London, the actual marriage takes place, but Arthur is still too sick to consummate the marriage. A year later, Arthur dies, leaving Catherine a widow. Henry VII, being a frugal man, does not wish to give back the dowry from her marriage and pushes Henry to consider marrying Catherine. Henry has some misgivings about the marriage, but as he is now heir to the throne, he decides it is best for the country politically. A year later, Queen Elizabeth of York dies in childbirth. Both Henrys must refocus their efforts. Henry VII feels that Henry the Younger is lacking in education that is required to be a proper king. So just interestingly, Catherine's parents are the ones who gave money to Columbus to sail to the New World, and they got this money by kicking the Jews out of Spain after conquering the Moors and reclaiming Spain for the Christians. So basically, this is getting us to Henry VIII, which is what's important. So Henry marries, the main thing you need to get out of this is Henry marries Catherine of Aragon. Catherine, because Arthur dies. So that's going to put Henry next in line to the throne. And now, this is going to play in. So now we got to jump over to Spain, Charles V, okay? So Charles V of Spain is known as the Holy Roman Emperor. He bought this, okay? So basically, he captures the Pope and takes him to Spain, okay? He captures the Pope, and he becomes the Holy Roman Emperor, okay? He bought the title from the Pope, and when his uncle King Henry asked for a divorce from his Aunt Catherine, now this is where we were, right? Henry VIII is married to Catherine of Aragon, right? Catherine is Henry's aunt, and Henry wants a divorce because Catherine hasn't given him any male children. Y'all know the story of Henry VIII, right? We could all sing the song, Henry VIII, I am, Henry VIII, I am, right? So Henry VIII wants a divorce. He wants it annulled. He doesn't want a divorce because you can't divorce if you're Catholic. He wants the marriage annulled. And the Pope has to do that. But Henry V has the Pope in custody, right? And he's not going to do it. So James IV of Scotland, he married Henry VIII's sister Margaret, and his grandson eventually is going to translate the Bible. So we're going to get to that. This is all important. So basically, because Charles V has the Pope in custody and has become the Holy Roman Empire, he refuses to grant an annulment to Henry VIII from Catherine of Aragon. So, Henry VIII. So Henry VIII, Henry VII dies in 1509. Henry VIII becomes king. He formally marries Catherine of Aragon. 1 year later, they have a daughter who dies. A year after that, they have a son whom they name Henry and rejoice at his birth. Feasting, revels continue for the better part of 2 weeks. 1 week later, he dies. Henry's frustrated. He does not have a child to continue his father's legacy. 2 years later, as part of politically moving, Mary Tudor, Henry's baby sister, is married off to the King of France, Louis XII. He is 34 years older than she is at the time of their marriage. 3 months later, the King of France is dead, and she marries her one true love, Charles Brandon, in a secret marriage, defying her brother. He later forgives her. Henry petitions to be the Holy Roman Emperor, a greatly coveted title, who we know that Charles V has at this point. In 1516, Catherine gives birth to a child that lives. They name her Mary. That's going to be important. Mary's going to be important. So she has a daughter, Mary. and it is said that she is a beautiful girl that resembles her mother. Henry loves her dearly, but she is not a suitable heir. A year later, Henry has a healthy son with Elizabeth Blunt, Henry Fitzroy. So he has a child out of wedlock with Elizabeth Blunt. That's really not going to play into our story. A year later, Martin Luther, a monk in Wittenberg, Germany, nails his 95 Theses to the door of the church. That probably never actually happened, but we like to say it did. So this is the beginning of the Reformation. When Luther basically prints his theses against the Catholic Church, a year after Henry becomes king, this is the beginning of the Reformation. So a lot of things religiously are in motion right now. A lot of things are religiously in motion. So, complaining of the corrupt nature of the Catholic Church, Henry, having been raised to enter the religious life, quickly writes a rebuke because Martin Luther printed this out. The story is he nailed it to the door of the Wittenberg church. Historically, we don't think that happened, but he did print it and he did send it. And King Henry VIII wrote a rebuttal and becomes a defender of the faith. Okay? And meanwhile, he meets with Francis I of France and holds a hugely overblown party called the Field of Cloth of Gold, so named for the elaborate lengths the two monarchs went. And this was all a show of good faith. They both turned their backs and made a treaty with each other's enemies. Henry and Catherine were married for 20 years, and Henry tries to get Catherine to go to a nunnery. But because she won't do this, he asks the Pope for divorce or annulment because he wants a legitimate son. Enter Anne Boleyn. Okay? So now, right, Henry can't get a son. He's been married for Catherine for 20 years. He can't get a son. He wants this annulment. He can't get it because Charles V won't give him an annulment, right? So he can't get an annulment. So he's ready to cut to Duras. So cut to 4 years later. So in 1525, Henry is disgruntled that the only male child he has a bastard child. In walks a beautiful and bewitching Anne Boleyn, fresh-faced and young, straight from the promiscuous court of France. Henry thinks he has found an ideal mistress, having already had her younger sister Mary. But Anne is too clever and holds out for marriage and the crown. Henry is so enchanted by her and her ability to hold him off that he appeals to Cardinal Thomas Wolsey to arrange a divorce for him as quickly as he would arrange one of Henry's entertainments. He wants the marriage declared invalid based on the marriage of Arthur to Catherine. He feels he is guilty of coveting his brother's wife. This would normally have been easy, but that pesky Charles V has heard of the impending divorce from his Aunt Catherine and has gone and taken the Pope captive, making it possible for the Pope to declare the marriage invalid. The entire time this is happening, Anne is staying just out of the Majesty's grasp, further frustrating him. He then decides, after 2 years of getting nowhere, that Thomas Wolsey must die, but before he can try him and have him executed, the cardinal dies in exile. So Henry is distraught. Henry VIII, he can't get his marriage annulled to Catherine. He wants Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn won't have him because she's holding off to be queen, right? And so Henry has to do something drastic. And so he does. And so Henry, he is going to basically break off from the Catholic Church, seize their assets, seize their churches, and going to start the Church of England so that he can annul his own marriage. Okay? That's important for us. So, in 1531, Thomas Canning and Thomas Cromwell come up with a lovely scheme to set things right. They decide to pass the Act of Supremacy, which says the Church of England must no longer answer to the Pope, but the King of England. So now we're going to divide the Church of England away from the Catholic Church. It must know, and so making it possible for Henry to declare his own marriage invalid, which he quickly does and marries Anne Boleyn. The people of England are furious. They are afraid to the Pope. They are afraid to the Pope, excommunicated each and every one of them, as well as angry that Henry would put aside his wife of 20 years for an upstart like Anne. Thomas More, one of Henry's most trusted advisors and chief minister, refused to sign the Act of Succession, and a year later he is beheaded for his refusal. Henry and Anne have a daughter, said to be the most beautiful of the land. They name her Elizabeth for Henry's mother. 3 years and 3 miscarriages later, Henry is ready for wife number 3. With no sons to ensure his legacy, Anne must go. Thomas Cromwell creates charge of adultery, incest, and treason, and Anne loses her head. So, and Anne went to lose her head with a Bible in her hand. Anne was a good gal. But anyway, she's going to be beheaded. So, and there's a story in that too. But moving on to Mary the First. So time goes on. And eventually, Henry's going to die. And Mary is going to become Queen of England, Mary the First. And Mary, we call her Bloody Mary. Mary decides she's going to bring Catholicism back to England. And because of that, and by now the Reformation is well in swing, okay? We're going to get back to that. The Reformation is well in swing by now, and we have Protestants in England. Now Protestants, what time is it? Okay. So what is a Protestant? Can anybody answer that question? Well, kinda. Well, no, we're not Protestants, okay? I know when you see that on the form and it's like, and you can mark Protestant, we're actually not Protestants. We came somewhat out of that movement, but Protestants are people technically who believe in faith-only salvation. That's what a Protestant technically is. It's a person that believes in faith-only salvation. Is really what a Protestant is.
No action, no requirement.
Right. Yeah. We'll talk about it because I can't tell you in 2 minutes how to explain that, but we're going to talk about it next week. So Mary comes along, and Mary, she kills all these Protestants. She wants to bring that back. We call her Bloody Mary. And after Mary, the next one we want to talk about then is Elizabeth I. So Elizabeth I, she was the daughter of Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII, okay? She's the daughter who lived. She brings Protestantism back to England and spreads it to the New World. She's a Protestant. She's not a Catholic, so she's a Protestant queen. So she brings that back to England and to the New World, which is us, okay? This is why all this is important. I'm trying to get to this point before we quit class. You say, Rex, why is all this important? This is why all this is important. This is our lineage. This is how we got here, okay? It says, so she spreads in the world. She defeats the Spanish Armada who tried to invade England after she came to the throne to keep it Catholic. So the Spanish Armada was come to make England back to Catholic. With the defeat of Spain, she made England a world trade power, and with a Protestantism spread. But Elizabeth I has no heir. So Elizabeth I, when she dies, she is going to make the King of Scotland at that time, who is James, okay? She is going to make him King of England, and his son is King James, who is going to bring us the Bible, okay? So all this plays out in your faith. So you might not think the royals are important, and I'm kind of with you for the most part. I don't really think they are either, but because of all this royal shenanigans and all this stuff that went on that I went through really, really quick, is going to lead us to getting the King James Bible. It's going to bring Protestantism to the New World because England is going to finance that, and it's going to bring Protestantism to us, and that's going to influence Christianity in the United States. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about Protestantism. We're going to back up in history now next time. I'm going to show you the religious side of all this, political side, how the religious side plays into the political side, and I'm going to show you how we came to be in this country, where Christianity came from in this country, and why, and I can explain to you a lot of why Christianity is what Christianity is at this particular point in history. That's what we're going to get to based on where we started here and how that's going to change when we get to this country and how we're all going to become who we become and why. And hopefully by the time I get done with this, you're going to be able to understand exactly why you're sitting in this pew, where you came from this morning. So thanks for your time. I hope I'm not boring you. I hope that you're getting something out of this. I know I rushed through a lot because I don't want to get bogged down in a lot of history. I just want to show you how history influenced religion and how history influenced religion in the United States. So we'll get more into the religious side. Next week we'll start to talk about Luther and Calvin and Zwingli and all those great reformers and how they influenced Christianity here. So I hope it's not boring. I hope you're getting something out of it. And you can always go back and look at this again on YouTube or Facebook. You can always Google it if you're more interested in how all these parties played out. Thanks for your time this morning.